Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. What drives American foreign policy? Values or merely interest? Washington claims it supports democracy as a universal value, but makes glaring exceptions when it suits its geopolitical purposes. And what about the neoconservative agenda? Is it the genetic code of Pax Americana? To crosstalk the neoconservatives and democracy, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, Mark Jacobson. He is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund and a senior advisor to the Truman National Security Project. And we also have Matthew Feeney. He is an assistant editor at Reason 24/7. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Matthew, if I can go to you first in Washington, would you describe American foreign policy as neoconservative?
I think it would be a little too simplistic to say that American foreign policy is explicitly neoconservative all the time. But that said, I do think that since the Cold War, we have, as a nation, been interfering far too much in other people's affairs. But like I said, I think it would be a little simplistic to say it's been blanketly neoconservative. OK, Matthew, if I can stay with you, would you say it doesn't matter what party's in power? If you said since the Cold War, end of the Cold War? I think that, sure, Democrats and Republicans have both demonstrated that they are willing to get engaged in other nations abroad, but obviously the events of 9/11 highlighted the Republicans as the ones that like to intervene in other countries, but it is by no means just a Republican trait. Okay, Mark, would you weigh in on that? Would you describe American foreign policy as neoconservative?
Absolutely not. I think words matter, phrases matter, and it's very important to understand neoconservatism in terms of U.S. foreign policy has to do with not only seeing the world as black and white, this a constant struggle between good and evil, but also the willingness to use military force to force democratization abroad.
Is that a good idea?
I think, certainly this administration.
Is that a good idea?
No, I think it's a horrible, absolutely horrible idea, and that's why the Obama administration, the election was an outright rejection of the neoconservative policies that guided the Bush administration. What I will say to Matthew's comments, though, is that American intervention abroad has been relatively consistent before the Cold War, after the Cold War, and during the Cold War. It didn't all of a sudden start where the U.S. started intervening abroad after 1990.
Okay, Matthew, you agree or disagree with that?
No, sure. I think. Well, no, I think Mark is right that neoconservatism has a definite definition that people like myself, especially people who don't favor intervention abroad, do sometimes flippantly use the term when it's not the most appropriate. But I do think that despite the fact that American foreign intervention might have been rather consistent, I do think that you can point to differences between different administrations. The Obama administration has certainly not been invading countries with the same fervor that the Bush administration did, but the drone strikes in Pakistan and our the continued existence of the prisons in Guantanamo Bay demonstrate that there are, some consistencies.
Mark, would you agree or disagree with that? Because a lot of people in the world would say there's no difference between Bush and Obama fundamentally.
I think there's a fundamental difference between Bush and Obama. I mean, you take a look at, and I think you take a look at, let's just take actions in Pakistan versus actions in Iraq. I mean, the Obama administration came in with two overarching goals: get the troops out of Iraq, which was a war of choice, not a war of necessity, and frankly, end the war in Afghanistan in a responsible way. The operations in Pakistan, I think, are a reflection of the desire not to intervene with ground troops, not to go try and force regime change. And I think that's fairly consistent if you look at what's often criticized. There's large criticism of U.S. policy in Egypt and Syria with regards to Iran. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that there are many shades of gray here. It's not just a neoconservative, you're either with us or against us mentality.
Matthew?
Yeah, I would add that I think it's important to remember that some of the neoconservatives, such as John McCain, who was a supporter for the war in Iraq, has said even in the situation that's developing in Syria that he doesn't support having boots in the ground. So it does obviously change depending on the situation. But I think that it's important to point out that an invasion of Pakistan is obviously something that I don't think even the Bush administration.
It's a non-starter. Invading
no,
Pakistan.
Of course, no, I agree. Right, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think even the most ardent, true neoconservatives would agree with that. But that said, I still think the impact of having violence committed by the United States on your country, whether it's from drones or ground troops, does have an effect on the population that we shouldn't ignore.
Mark, it's just because the means are different, the ideology is different? Drones?
No, actually, I think it's very important not to confuse the use of a new type of weapon with some sort of changed ideological approach. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that the use of drones reflects the desire to limit potentially U.S. casualties, and frankly, I know there's a debate about this, limit civilian casualties on the ground, but that's nothing new. This is an evolution that began in the Second World War. I mean, you take a look, or I should say as a reaction to the Second World War, it was no longer acceptable to go carpet bomb cities and not worry about civilian casualties. So you take a look at the 1980s, the 1990s, the Gulf War, Kosovo, Bosnia. I mean, the desire has been to limit casualties and to intervene in a more humanitarian way. But let me add one other point that I think is critical. When you look at neoconservatism, you're talking about the unilateral use of force, whereas I would argue the Clinton administration and the Obama administration have been about using force within the constraints of the international community. UN resolutions, NATO action, not the unilateral type of use of force we saw during the war in Iraq.
Matthew, address Libya.
Sure, but I think Mark's point is well intended. I mean, Libya was a NATO-supported intervention and mission, and I don't really mind if it's the United States doing it or other Western governments. I think the intervention in Libya has had effects that we are going to be living with for a while, especially if you consider the situations now in Mali and Algeria. But that said,
well, that's an understatement. That's an understatement, don't you think? That's an understatement. I mean, we have arms going everywhere, all over the region.
Yes,
okay, unintended consequences on a massive scale.
No, look, I'm pointing out Libya only to say that even interventions where the U.S. does not act unilaterally can have, disastrous effects that are difficult to plan for.
Mark, what about democracy promotion?
But this is the world. I would argue this is the world we live in right now. If you take a look at the world we live in, it's oversimplifying it to say damned if you do, damned if you don't. But these are complex problems that if you don't do anything, let's just take Libya and Syria, you don't do anything, then you run the risk of a massive humanitarian disaster, civilian casualties, brutal repression by regimes.
Or you'll make it worse.
But you could make it better too. I mean, is Libya itself better off or worse off than it was before? I mean, that's the open question, but what it actually requires is a commitment by the international community to deal with the consequences.
Okay, well, they're certainly not doing a very good job of it. Matthew, go ahead.
No, okay, so the question of will things get better with or without intervention is, a debate that people can, I mean, I would argue that intervening in Syria, especially right now, would really not be the right thing to do. Now, obviously, do I know for certain? I don't know for certain, but this is a sort of a secondary question to the first thing that should be considered, which is, I mean, why should the United States have the role of intervening in these places in the first place? And, that's something that we really should be drastically reconsidering. I still am at a loss to understand why the U.S. administrations feel the need to be involved in every crisis that develops around the world. It can have really, really disastrous consequences that are not ever, I don't think, ever fully considered.
Mark? Would you like to address that?
But I don't think that's the case at all. I think you actually see a resistance to getting involved. Let's take a couple of them in Africa, for example. In Libya, in fact, the U.S. was criticized domestically and in some cases abroad for not being in charge. You recall the unfortunate phrase, leading from behind. The U.S. said, well, hold on, Europeans. This is an issue for you. We'll support you with specific needs. Air power, for example, especially surveillance and some intelligence assets. Similarly in Mali, I mean, that was a French unilateral action. That was not NATO action. The U.S. certainly wasn't in the lead, but in fact, it's a more responsible use of power to say at times, look, we need the Arab League to take the lead on things such as in Libya, or perhaps we need to have the African Union take the lead on some other issues. So I actually think this administration has been reflective of a critical eye towards selective engagement, and I don't think it's reflective of a U.S. foreign policy that's actively interventionist.
Matthew, do you want to address that? Because we still have issues like Israel, and we still have Iran. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, well, the intervention in Mali is interesting because obviously a lot of American equipment was and American bases, if I remember correctly, were used for logistics. It's very hard to imagine that the French could have unilaterally done this, in the way that they did without some sort of American support. And I would also like to point out that intervention in Syria, if you do polls on the American public, is hardly a popular policy for people to endorse. But nonetheless, the Obama administration, now that the red line has been crossed, has said that arms will be sent to selected rebels. So whether it's popular domestically doesn't seem to affect the Obama administration.
Mark, before we go to the break, you want to react to that?
I think there's some nuance here. There's some nuance here that's important. In terms of Mali, I think that's actually reflective of the way NATO works and the way that I should say, U.S. relationships with the Europeans work. Very often, the U.S. provides logistical.
I'm going to jump in here. We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on neocons and democracy. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing neocons and democracy. Mark, if I can go back to you in Washington, are neocons really interested in democracy, or is it just a cover?
No, I think neocons are interested in democracy, but I think they're guided by a sort of misunderstanding that you can force people to be free. You take a look at the Cold War, for example. It was more important to have revolutions, democratic revolutions, come from within. It's something that can't be forced from the outside, because democracy in the end is about more than going through the process of voting. It's about concepts and an understanding of the responsibilities of being a free society, and that can't be imposed from the outside.
So how do you feel about the coup in Egypt?
Well, it depends if you want to use the word coup or not.
Oh, my goodness. Come on. It was a military coup. I can't believe people are still saying this. Come on, Mark. It was a military coup. The military took over.
I have no issue with the fact that the military took over. That's factual. What I'm saying is, if the United States is in an awkward position where it wants to help try and keep Egypt on a positive path.
Why does Washington have that responsibility? Why is that Washington's responsibility? Why? The people voted.
Who else is willing to put the money into the development and governance programs? Look, as a U.S. taxpayer, I would be thrilled if the rest of the world wants to pick up the tab and help the Egyptian civil society, help the Egyptian rule of law programs,
Maybe we should just leave them alone.
I don't see anyone stepping up for it.
Maybe we should just leave them alone.
If you want to just leave them alone into chaos and not help out, I mean, isn't this what the international community is about?
We supported Mubarak. We created a lot of this chaos here. Matthew, weigh in.
No, I don't think that it's the role of the U.S. government to ensure stability in Egypt. I also think, as a American taxpayer as well, I don't like the idea of, taking money from poor people here and sending it to rich people abroad. I think if people want to donate to the stability of Egypt, then they can be more than welcome to do so. But, I'm someone who believes that the government should be limited in its roles, and I don't think foreign aid is one of those at all. And I would also like to point out that when it comes to Egypt, America's position's been a little confused. I mean, maybe Mark has a different opinion, but I can't see. We seem to be okay with Islamists and the military and Mubarak. It just seems very confused, and I wish there was some sort of, if we were going to have foreign aid, that there was some sort of, conditional attachments to it.
Mark?
Well, there are conditional attachments to foreign aid, and let me parse my own statement. I am a big supporter of foreign aid. I mean, we forget that it's only about 1.5% of the U.S. budget, where people think it's this massive 25%. Absolutely incorrect. But
yeah, but Israel is a very rich country. Israel is a very rich country, and it gets a lot of money from the United States. Why?
I think what you have to look at are where those programs are important and where they're having an impact. Whether you are a rich country that needs help with security assistance, and I would argue that if you take a look at joint projects between Israel and the United States, let's look at Iron Dome, for example. What a very positive thing, not just for Israel, but frankly for the rest of the world, to be able to stop terrorist rockets from killing civilians. That's a good thing, no matter which country you're in.
Well, maybe they should just end the apartheid system there, and you wouldn't have to worry about it.
Do you think that...
Go ahead, Matthew.
No, I'm just curious if Mark thinks that the Israeli economy would be able to support defense systems like Iron Dome without American involvement.
Mark?
I'm honestly curious.
Well, I think they're on the right path. I mean, you take a look at all the innovation and the startup industries in Israel. There's the wonderful book, Startup Nation, that's been written by it. I think you're seeing an Israeli economy that's growing at a significant rate, and there will be a point where they can do things like this. But with all, I would argue, with all heavy R&D, research and development programs, it's useful for countries to share those startup costs. I think you're dealing with a very peculiar security situation. You have Arab nations and you have terrorist groups that are calling for the utter destruction of the people. And frankly, more of the international community should be out there saying this is unacceptable. If there's going to be a final settlement,
the illegal occupation of the West Bank is illegal too.
You have to stop calling for the destruction of the country.
Okay, Matthew, go ahead.
Look, I absolutely don't believe that, and I do condemn people who call for the destruction of Israel, and I think there are plenty of politicians in the West that do defend Israel's right to exist. My only point here is that there is a certain irony that we seem to be giving aid to Israel with R&D and Iron Dome and things like this, but then we are also giving aid to countries, I mean, sometimes military aid to countries that are among some of the worrying countries that Mark has mentioned. And I think there's a little bit of a moral contradiction here.
Yeah, like Saudi Arabia, Mark, okay? Not necessarily the beacon of democracy there.
Well, I'm going to agree with Matthew on something. I think there are some serious challenges predating this administration, I would say going back to the Cold War, with regards to how we dole out security assistance. I mean, this country and frankly the world is going to suffer as a result of the support that many countries have given some of these dictatorial regimes. And frankly, I think we should be spending our foreign aid money on developing the civil society in these countries so that we can foster those internal transitions I spoke about. That's easier said than done, but I am in agreement that we have to reshape our security assistance, and I think the administration is doing a decent job of this, but we have to reshape the security assistance in order to support overall efforts at promoting democracy abroad.
Okay, I mentioned Saudi Arabia.
So just to...
would you like to address that, okay? One of the most autocratic regimes in the world.
No, my position is that we shouldn't be giving Saudi Arabia, much assistance at all. And look, I think even if you believe that foreign aid is something worthwhile doing and that the government does have a role in doing this, then surely there's got to be some sort of moral line that is drawn, and that you would hope Saudi Arabia would not be able to meet, the pretty basic criterion of, civil society and human rights. But I don't know if Mark agrees or not.
Mark? I mean, it's very contradictory.
Actually, that's exactly the type of. There are contradictions there, no doubt, but that's where I think conditionality has to come into play. And frankly, I think it would be worth reviewing, whether it's in academia, in Congress, or in the administration, how we provide aid to some of these countries and what conditions are put on these countries so that they improve their human rights record, so that they improve the way they deal with their own civil society. But I would argue, for example, the U.S. Department of State has funded the Middle East North Africa Trust to promote this type of democracy. So I don't think that the administration is acting deliberately in contradiction. I think what we have are many nations out there, particularly in the Gulf, that are not as supportive of their peoples as they should be. And this is going to be a problem. This is going to create more problems for those ruling powers than it is for the rest of us. The Arab Spring is just one indication of that.
Okay, Matthew, go ahead. I mean, here we have the Saudis exporting jihadism in Syria, and that's an ally of the United States.
No, yeah, and I obviously won't condone that sort of behavior at all. But I'm interested in I agree with Mark, there has to be a review of this sort of stuff, and I'm not sure how it could be potentially implemented, but I think, that the military aid should really be what we focus on cutting back on. I think, like I said before, let's grant, I don't agree, but let's grant that foreign aid is worthwhile doing and it's a good thing for governments to do. Even maybe we should, focus on the things that aren't deadly, things like infrastructure and these sorts of things. The idea that we're still going to be sending F-16 jets to Egypt, regardless of who's in charge, is, to me, seems a little insane. And I agree with Mark that it should absolutely be reviewed.
Okay, well, Mark, what do you think about that? Because in the case of Egypt, the United States was supporting civil society, or at least liberal elements of it, and the military. Is the U.S. too involved in a country like Egypt? It's contradictory.
I don't
both sides against the middle.
Too involved in a country like Egypt. I think your comments earlier reflect how complicated it is. You spoke about Saudi Arabia supporting jihadis. The challenge is that a lot of these people who are in Syria are trying to overthrow a dictatorial regime.
Egypt had an election. That's the difference between the two. Isn't it?
And U.S. policy is not trying to tell the Egyptians what to do. It's, this is this whole argument over, well, how do you respond to a coup? Well, look, the Egyptian military and the Egyptian people are sorting this out. I mean, for me, the most important metric was the appointment of interim civilian authority within days of this taking place. Had the military taken control and not appointed an interim authority, I would probably have a much different view. Okay. But given the situation, I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't not be involved.
You should respect
and be involved
elections.
At the same time.
You should respect elections, right?
Well, I think the administration's been clear that you need to, that there are appropriate ways of doing this.
And it hasn't, because it won't call it a coup.
Even if you,
come on, it doesn't call it a coup.
They won't call it a coup because that puts certain conditions on, or actually results in a breach of some of the conditions. And frankly, that's not in the Egyptian people's best interest right now.
Okay, I wonder who knows what the best interests of the Egyptian people are. Go ahead, jump in. 30 seconds, last word. Matthew, go ahead.
Look, no, I was just going to say, look, whatever you think about the situation in Egypt, they might be sorting it out, but there's a huge amount of violence going on, and I was no fan of Morsi by any means, but I still think it's too early to say if it was the right thing to do, but whether this coup will be successful or not. But I agree with. I mean, I just think what else you can call it other than a coup when the military forcibly removes a government, I don't know. But as Mark points out,
we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love his voice.